Knowledge is not power, that's power. The brain is a muscle, and that's a muscle, and that's a muscle, and they are all muscles, this is all muscle, so I am covered in brains, and I have more brains than you.
Welcome back. If-then. An if-then statement, or an if-then logical relation, provides us with two things we can do validly and two things we tend to do that are invalid. So that we have something actually in mind, let's take an example. If he's breathing, then he's alive. Now, when we're dealing with logic, we're dealing with logical relations, not necessarily any particular instance. So what's actually being taught here are the general inferential rules with regard to if-then statements. I'm only illustrating it with a case that happens to be true because it makes it easier for us to think about it. In other words, don't get too bogged down on the example. Think about the logic behind it. When presented with the if-then logical relation, we have two valid and two invalid things we can do with it. The valid options, i.e., the two ways we can correctly reason or make an inference from an if-then logical relation are: we could affirm the antecedent, which is saying yes to the if part, then yes to the then part. In other words, we confirm that the individual is breathing and conclude that he is alive. This is logically valid. It follows, necessarily, provided the if-then relation is true. The other valid use of the if-then relation, denying the consequent. In other words, saying no to the then part and then no to the if part, which for our example would be, he's not alive, therefore he's not breathing. This is necessarily the case whenever the if-then relation holds. Not just for this example, but logically for any example. Your two valid inferential uses of the if-then logical relation are: you can A the A, affirm the antecedent, say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and you can D the C, deny the consequent, say no to the then no to the if. You can A the A and D the C. So what are the two invalid moves? The two incorrect logical moves or inferences that we tend to make when we encounter if-then logical relations. The invalid moves are affirming the consequent, which is saying yes to the then part, then yes to the if part. Here that would look like saying, he's alive, therefore he's breathing. This is not necessarily logically true. It can always follow that he's alive from the fact that he's breathing, but it need not necessarily always follow from the fact, given our if-then relation, that if he's alive, he's breathing. If you've taken a CPR course, then you see how this holds up with the example. The other invalid move we tend to make with if-then logical relations is denying the antecedent, which is saying no to the if part and then no to the then part. For example, he's not breathing, therefore he's not alive. The logical statement says that he is alive if he is breathing. The logical statement does not say he is only alive if he's breathing. If you're ever choking on something, hopefully the people around you, who might be able to help, don't conclude that if you're not breathing, you're not alive. So there's two moves that you can't make validly with if-then statements, with an if-then logical relation. You can't A the C, you can't affirm the consequent, you can't say yes to the then part, then yes to the if part. You can't D the A, you can't deny the antecedent, you can't say no to the if part, then no to the then part. You can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. But let's take a note here from the humor lecture, because you, on some cool fundamental level, actually understand these logical relations and rules. We know this in part because you find things funny that break the rules.
Might need to think about getting a job.
Get a job? Serious?
Yeah.
I have a job. Do you know what my job is? I save the planet.
Yeah.
Maybe you should get a job.
I have a job.
Really? Hitting the machine with the words that come out of it? Oh, this is knowledge. Knowledge is power. No, it's not. Knowledge is not power. That's power. The brain is a muscle, and that's a muscle, and that's a muscle. And they are all muscles. This is all muscle. So I am covered in brains, and I have more brains than you.
The brain is a muscle, so I am covered in brains and have more brains than you. Now, we know he made some sort of mistake here, and it turns out that it's a basic logical mistake. He found a true if-then relationship. He found the relationship, knowledge is power. If you have brains, then you have muscle. There's a bit of ambiguity of terms here, but philosophical charitability is a virtue. The relation he found was, if brains, then muscle. We could stretch it out a bit to, all brains are muscle. But this does not mean, necessarily, that all muscle is brains. It's not impossible, but it's certainly not logically necessary for muscle to equal brains wherever brains are muscle. So Thor Odinson comes up with, if brains then muscle, and he would have some valid uses of this new knowledge is power meme that he's picked up. The valid uses include, I have brains, therefore I have muscle. And again, we're being charitable here. So this is affirming the antecedent. Or he could come up with, if one has no muscle, then one has no brains. Because imagine the entirety of the muscle circle disappeared, the entirety of the brains circle would disappear as well. Because the brain circle is subsumed within the muscle circle. So those are the two valid things that Thor could have done with his new knowledge. His new concept that knowledge is power. But of course, with this concept, with this if-then relation, comes invalid uses of it. He could conclude, for example, that if he has muscle, then he has brains. He could affirm the consequent. Now, the logical issue with this is that it doesn't necessarily follow. Why? Because there's plenty of muscle that isn't brains. So acquiring more muscle doesn't mean acquiring more brains necessarily. So this is logically an invalid move because you could gain muscle that's not brains. Or you could have muscle that isn't brains. The other incorrect inference that Thor could make is no brains, therefore no muscle. So he could deny the antecedent. What would happen if you took out all the brains? Well, it looks like there'd still be a lot of muscle left. So saying no to the if part and then no to the then part would in this case be wrong because not all muscle equals brains. Another example.
But I want to thank my family. They say that funny people often come from a difficult childhood or a troubled family. So to my family, I say, they're giving me the Mark Twain Prize for American humor. What did you animals do to me?
This is another case of affirming the consequent, saying yes to the then and then yes to the if. If bad childhood, then funny, funny, therefore bad childhood, affirming the consequent. She can't validly conclude from the if-then statement, if you have a bad childhood, then you'll be funny, that she had a bad childhood because she was funny, because the if-then statement doesn't imply complete overlap of bad childhood and funny. So she can be wrong if she got some of the funny that happens to not come from a bad childhood. A denying the antecedent version of this joke, in other words, if Tina Fey had created a joke from this if-then statement by making the other invalid inference, denying the antecedent, it might go something like, they say funny people often come from a difficult childhood, but my childhood was great, so you guys are all wrong. I'm not actually funny. And with the right delivery, that might actually work. Next, a family classic, Captain Ron. Now for background, Martin is a family man looking to take his wife and 2 kids on a sailing trip. After numerous other misadventures, they end up in a squall, a storm, and these lines come right after Captain Ron loses their navigation charts and their compass.
Everybody listen to me! Listen to me! The boss is right! We should be okay! Because I know we're near land! Straight, Cap, straight! Do you hear that? We're almost there! Explain to the kids how you know that, Captain. All right, now stay with me. When we left, we had just enough fuel to make it to San Juan. And we are out of fuel!
Now what Captain Ron knows is if they make it to San Juan, then they'll be out of fuel. This is a true statement, or true enough for him to validly conclude two things, but being an if-then relation, it also opens him up to making a couple types of mistakes. The particular mistake he makes is the same one just made by Tina Fey and the God of Thunder before her. Captain Ron says yes to the then part of the if-then statement, and then yes to the if. He says, we're out of fuel, therefore we're at San Juan. He affirms the consequent, one of the two things you can't do. You can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. You can say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and you can say no to the then no to the if, but you can't say yes to the then yes to the if, and you can't say no to the if, then no to the then. A denying the antecedent version of this joke, in other words, if the screenwriters had created a joke from this if-then statement by making the other invalid inference, saying no to the if, then no to the then, it might be Captain Ron saying that the fuel gauge must be broken, because it says they're at a fuel, but they aren't at San Juan, so they can't be at a fuel. Elementary logic. So here are your rules all on one page. When you have an if-then logical relation, you can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. Put the long way, you can say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and say no to the then no to the if, but you can't say yes to the then yes to the if, or say no to the if, then no to the then. Now let's use our knowledge to test an if-then statement to see whether it holds up. This is the Wason selection task with which you may be familiar. Each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. We are testing to see whether an if-then statement is correct. We get to flip over two cards, and the two cards that we get to flip over should correspond to the two valid forms of interaction with if-then statements. The other two cards correspond to invalid ways of interacting with if-then statements. So if we flip either of the two valid cards, then they are good tests of the if-then statement, because a violation of the if-then rule, in the cases that should be valid, shows you that the if-then rule is not being followed. Our if-then statement is, if the card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. In other words, if vowel, then even number. So our task is to find the two cards representative of the valid interpretations of the logical rule. We get to turn two cards over, and the two cards we turn over we want to be the two valid cards. Now the first one is admittedly a freebie. The if-then statement is if vowel, then even number. So obviously you're going to flip the vowel to see whether there's an even number on the other side. You just follow the statement. This is A-ing the A, affirming the antecedent, or, if we were in a logic course, modus ponens reasoning. Note that flipping the A, or the vowel, could either corroborate the rule. If it has an even number on it, it corroborates the rule, or it could discorroborate, disconfirm, or disprove that the rule is being followed. If you flip this A over, if you flip this vowel over, and you find an odd number on it, then this rule is being broken. Or, a more intuitive way to put this that connects with people better is the rule lied to you. The rule said if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side, but it has an odd number on the other side. The if-then statement is a lie. If we flip over this vowel card and it's even, we've confirmed the rule, and if we flip it over and it's odd, we've disconfirmed or falsified the rule. Visually, we know if we flip this over and it happens to be an odd number, we know that there is at least one case where the vowel does not correspond to an even number. So the correct drawing of our if-then statement, up in the upper right corner, is wrong. We could be dealing with a partial affirmative type of situation here, where some vowels are on a card with an even number, or maybe no vowels are on cards with even numbers. Regardless, if we flip the A and it has an odd number on the other side, the if-then rule has been broken and falsified. But that one was rather obvious. It's of course the second option that actually trips people up. The second test is not how we're used to thinking. This is denying the consequent, or modus tollens reasoning. What's our second choice? The rule is, if the card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. Denying the consequent is saying no to the then no to the if. So which card corresponds to the negation of the then statement? Keep in mind that all cards have a number on one side and a letter on the other. That rule is not being tested. It is never broken. It is an eternal truth. What we're testing is this if-then statement, and what I'm scaffolding you through is picking the card that would deny the consequent. This is where you should write down or somehow make visible your thinking. Doing that is the first step towards putting together an argument for it, and it's figuring out the argument that lets you teach yourself you're wrong, which is far more important than finding out why you're right. The card that denies the consequent is the one with an odd number on it. Specifically, if we flip over an odd-numbered card and it has a vowel on the other side, then the rule has lied to us. Rule, you said that if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other side. But look, I just found this odd number and I flipped him over and he had a vowel on the other side. You're wrong, Rule. You lied to me. One of the reasons this may not be intuitive to us is that we can only disconfirm the claim with this card selection. If it's a vowel, then we've disconfirmed the rule, falsified it. But if it's a consonant, well then it's irrelevant. But if it's a vowel, then, we don't know how to diagram this. What would be the actual proposition that maps this reality out? Maps vowels to even numbers on cards. But what about the other cards? What about the two mistakes that we can make? Well, the typical wrong answer is to seek more confirmation. This is the error of affirming the consequent, A-ing the C, saying yes to the then part, and then yes to the if part, which is wrong because the claim if vowel then number does not mean if number then vowel. If you make it to San Juan, you'll be out of fuel. Doesn't mean you're out San Juan if you're out of fuel. So which card corresponds to affirming the consequent? Saying yes to the then part. Flipping over the even number, which is not a valid test of the rule. Your justification might be something like, well, I'm going to flip over the even number and then see if it has a vowel on it. Well, fine, if it happens to have a vowel on it, then maybe that feels like it corroborates the rule. I certainly wouldn't argue it was a coincidence. But what if you happen to flip it over and it's a consonant? Well, that doesn't falsify anything, because if it happens to be a consonant, it could just be one of the even numbers in even number space that happens to not have a vowel on the side of it. Note that the two valid card flips, the two that actually test whether the if-then statement is true, can both falsify the rule, which is the point, to try to falsify and see whether falsification occurs. One of the reasons this example is so powerful is because it's an analogy, or it's a model for how your brain works with problems. How your brain works with ideas, ideologies, beliefs, concepts, values. If you run a first initial test, if you flip over that initial A, and the first test corroborates the thing you're assessing, the next move of a scientist would be to move on to a more rigorous test. The next move of your brain tends to be to look for more confirmation, which is the best that flipping over even-numbered card could do. The other answer that very few students pick, although some people do choose it, is the one that corresponds with denying the antecedent. Flipping over the consonant card does nothing to test the if vowel then even number claim. Say you flip it over and there's an even number on it. That's irrelevant, because nobody said that all even numbers have vowels on the other side. Alright, so say you flip it over and it has an odd number on the other side. Well, then it's all kinds of irrelevant. I think that students who pick this card probably forget the rules, and they think maybe there could be an A on the other side, but we've set up the rules of the universe such that there's always a number on one side and a letter on the other. So flipping B is all kinds of pointless. An activity for you to do. The rule is, if the lights are on, someone is home. We're seeing whether this rule holds up. So from left to right, the house card says, somebody's home. Let's see whether the light's on. The light bulb with a not sign over it says the lights aren't on. Let's see if somebody's home. The light bulb says the lights are on. Let's see if somebody's home. And the house with a not sign over it says nobody's home. Let's see whether the lights are on. Which of these cards, then, corresponds to affirming the antecedent? in the notes will be the answers. I want you to write down your answer. Which corresponds with denying the consequent. Moving on to improper ways to test the if-then statement, which card shows the poor choice of affirming the consequent? And which card shows denying the antecedent? What does this have to do with context, the subject of this lecture? It turns out that the task you are given, or the role that you have, or the schema that's active when you're testing if-then relations, influences the decisions that you tend to make, at least in Wason selection tasks. And this is a good thing, since those schemas form the situation that in some cases mean that errors are fatal or more important. Pragmatic approaches ask what you are doing with something, not what the task is, but what is it accomplishing. First, having a rationale improves Wason card task performance. Let's imagine a scenario where you are an immigration officer at the international airport in China. Among the documents you have to check is a sheet called Form H. One side of the form indicates whether the passenger is entering the country or in transit, the first two boxes there, while the other side of the form lists names of diseases. You have to make sure that if the form says entering on one side, then the other side includes COVID among the list of diseases. Which of the following forms or cards would you have to turn over to check? Indicate only the two that you need to check to be sure. Now, what I just gave you were the instructions for the no rationale condition. I did not specifically tell you why you were checking the if entering then COVID relation. Around 60% of participants choose the two correct cards in this no rationale condition. The correct cards being the ones on the far left, A the A, and the far right, D the C. To dramatically improve performance on the same task, we only need to add a reason or rationale for checking Form H. For that rationale condition, you only need to add a single sentence. That sentence is, this is to ensure that entering passengers are protected against the disease. Adding this sentence brought correct performance up from 60% to 90%. The same task, same role, same stimuli, we just added why. We gave participants a rationale. Note that the original research used hepatitis, typhoid, and cholera as the then diseases. COVID wasn't there. This notion of pragmatic schemas was further distilled down into the idea of deontic selection, or permission schemas. Reviewed in last lecture's reading, Minda's Psychology of Thinking, pages 140 to 142, is the idea of deontic selection. That is, choosing the cards based on rules, which seem to remind us to select the cards based on what's not there, i.e. those without COVID on their Form H do not have permission to enter China. The insight from Cheng and Holyoake in 1985 was that confirmation bias may produce so many errors, i.e. only 60% accuracy, because the alternative, the correct approach, the use of disconfirmatory evidence, denying the consequent, is impractical in everyday life. Denying the consequent is often not our default approach unless we are thinking in terms of permission or limitation. This is because permission schemas remind us of what one cannot do, such as enter China without being vaccinated for COVID. And they get us to look for rule violators, or, as I've already mentioned, liars. Now let's take a look at some if-then statements in the wild. First off, this construction is foundational. The Wason card selection task has been called the reason why cognitive psychology and psychology of thinking exists as a field of study. So let's see how fundamental it is, how ubiquitous the if-then construction is. The Socratic universal statement, all men are mortal, is an if-then statement. If man, then mortal. Not identical, but we can certainly treat it that way. And all that we know about how we can interact with if-then statements does apply. All men are mortal if man, then mortal. Socrates is a man. The minor premise of this classic syllogism is an affirmation of the antecedent. It's saying yes to the if. And then the conclusion is just the rest of the affirmation. It's saying yes to the then. So, what if Socrates is not a man? Is he then immortal? Which error would that be? It would be D'ing the A, denying the antecedent. What if Socrates is mortal? Could we conclude from his being mortal that he is a man? Well, which error is that? Aing the C, affirming the consequent. Just to throw a stone at you now, consider a compound syllogism, which is just a syllogism that begins with a compound proposition. Like if then, either or both and. Sam is either joking or serious. This is a disjunctive proposition. If he smiles, then he's not serious. So line 1 shows us we have a disjunctive proposition. It's an either or, and since this compound syllogism starts with a disjunctive proposition, it's a disjunctive syllogism. The second line is our if-then statement. Third, we have an affirmation of the antecedent. And fourth, we have a logical conclusion. Smiling rules out serious, and since our only other entertained or formalized option was joking, we conclude that he's joking. I include this example because it's likely reflective of actual thinking, and it illustrates that compound syllogisms, despite having only 3 terms, just like normal syllogisms, and despite seeming to be roughly the same thing as our previous examples, are their own beast. Our Euler circles will not do an adequate job of diagramming this syllogism, and Aristotelian rules don't apply. Only attempt to diagram this argument if you would like your brain to hurt. If you try it, then your brain will hurt. That's an if-then statement we've just encountered in the wild. If you try it, then your brain will hurt. Trying it means hurt brain. So you can affirm the antecedent. Not having a hurt brain means you didn't try it. Well, good, yeah, because if you had tried it, then your brain would hurt. So if your brain doesn't hurt, then you didn't try it. All right, it's denying the consequent. But having brain pain does not necessarily mean that you tried it. That would be affirming the consequent, and not trying it doesn't ensure an absence of brain pain. Because we're not saying that diagramming a compound syllogism is the only thing that can give you brain pain. That would be denying the antecedent. Next, Aristotle's 6 rules. Last lecture, we learned that there are 2 things that can go wrong with an argument, aside from having ambiguous terms, in which case you don't really have an argument. The 2 things that can go wrong with an argument are, 1, it could have false premises, which generally is a matter for judgment, not logic. Or 2, the conclusion could not follow from the premises. In other words, the argument could be invalid. Aristotle's 6 rules for checking syllogisms allow us to see whether simple syllogisms, at least, are valid. If they break any of the rules, they are invalid. We have 2 rules about structure, 2 rules about distribution of terms, and 2 rules about negative propositions. First, a syllogism must have 3 and only 3 terms. So, in the classic syllogism we have, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Your 3 terms are men, mortal, and Socrates. Last lecture, we considered this abomination of reasoning. Let's count our terms. Robots, 6'3" people, Brian, Candy, and Canada. Now this one breaks a bunch of other rules too, but it certainly breaks the only 3 terms rule. Next, a syllogism must have 3 and only 3 propositions. Specifically, a major premise, which will have the major term, that is the predicate of the conclusion, a minor premise, the subject of which is the subject of the conclusion, and the conclusion. Major, minor, and conclusion. Adding a proposition makes it by definition something other than a syllogism, or an entirely different form of syllogism. I mentioned that we were breaking this rule in our Karen example from last lecture before I made it okay by showing that we were actually making a Socrates. Note that this example also violates the 3 terms rule by adding a 4th term, Karen. If anyone is distracted when I use this example by the fact that the internet has recently decided to use Karen as a derogatory term, Then this is a good example of the weed theory of memes. The meme, the Karen meme, is trying to activate, replicate, grow, spread itself in your brain despite not being bidden or intended by you, and despite its activation coming at an actual cost to you in the form of distraction or irrelevance. If you don't know what I mean, then just bin this as irrelevant. Next, the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The middle term must be distributed at least once. The middle term, in logic, is the one that does not appear in the conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You have your three terms, men, mortal, and Socrates. Which of those three terms doesn't show up in the conclusion sentence? It's man. Therefore, man is the middle term. Distribution refers to whether the term makes a claim about all of something. For example, all men are mortal. That's a distributed term. Another example would be no fish are birds. You're saying something about all fish, that none of them are birds. So the term fish is distributed because you're claiming to know something about all of that thing. We'll go through each type of proposition here. If I say all men are mortal, then I'm making a claim to know something about all men. My subject term, men, is distributed in my major premise. My middle term is distributed. I am indeed claiming to know something about all men. If I say no men are mortal, then I am making a claim that I know something about all men, so my subject term men is distributed again in my major premise. And in this E proposition case, I'm claiming to know something about all mortal things, specifically that none of them are men. So my major premise's predicate, mortal or mortality, is also distributed. Note that here our knowledge of the predicate term is also distributed in the conclusion predicate, where I am claiming to know something about all of mortality in my conclusion, namely that all of mortality does not contain Socrates. If I say some men are mortal, then I'm neither claiming to know something about all men nor all mortal things. So I've not distributed anything, not my subject, not my predicate. So it's appropriate then that no term is distributed in the conclusion as well. In other words, no claim to know about the mortality of Socrates can be validly made in the conclusion. The middle term, the one that does not appear in the conclusion, is not distributed. No claim to know about all of it is made. So, to make a conclusion from the other two terms would be fallacious, hence all the question marks. Note, of course, that this does not mean that we can say nothing about Socrates and his possible mortality. It just means that we need different thinking tools, probabilistic ones, to come to an understanding here. Finally, if I say some men are not mortal, then I'm not claiming to know something about all men, the subject of my major premise, and also the middle term, but I am claiming to know something about all of mortality. Specifically, I somehow know that some men lie outside of it. It's again appropriate that no term is distributed in the conclusion. We cannot validly conclude things about the other two terms if the middle term is not distributed. Again, this does not mean that we can say nothing about Socrates and his possible mortality. We just need different thinking tools, probabilistic ones, to tackle what we can or should conclude about what we know. Note that the four A, E, I, O proposition type arguments presented all have predicates in their first two premises that are different, i.e. the two syllogism premises have different predicates, specifically mortal and man. We had an example of an undistributed middle with our penguin cartoon. All penguins are black and white. Good. Penguins is now a distributed term because we made a claim to know something about all penguins. Next premise, some old TV shows are black and white. Okay, well, neither of these terms are distributed in this premise. Conclusion, therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Well, there are a few ways that this is terrible, but one simple way to know this syllogism is invalid is that the middle term, black and white, the one not appearing in the conclusion, is not distributed. No claim to know about the entirety of black and white things has been made. Just observing this fact is enough to say the conclusion does not follow. Note that the other diagnostic red flag, namely that the predicates of the two premises are the same, X are black and white, also show that this is not a proper syllogism. It is reasoning by analogy. But it's absurdly common, a demonstration of the commonality of this version of the fallacy of the undistributed middle, specifically the case where the predicates of both premises are the same, is Godwin's law of the internet. Wait long enough, and any discussion will eventually lead to something being grouped with Hitler or Nazis. You know who had anti-smoking campaigns? Hitler's Nazi Germany. The implied argument being, the government wants to restrict my smoking, Nazis wanted to restrict smoking, therefore the government is a Nazi one. The predicates of both premises are the same, wants to restrict smoking. So, this is reasoning by analogy, or an attempt at reasoning via syllogism that's committed the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Next rule, now that we have an idea of what distribution means. In the Socrates A syllogism, mortal is undistributed. That's okay, because we don't need to know about all mortal things, just all men, and that Socrates is a man. Recall that the major term of a syllogism is the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term of a syllogism is the subject of that conclusion. So, here, in our conclusion, the subject is Socrates, and the predicate is mortal. The minor term is Socrates, and the major term is mortal. Going all the way back to a few minutes ago, we looked at this syllogism as an if-then relation. In that case, the error of denying the antecedent, saying Socrates is not a man, and concluding that he is therefore not mortal, would be an example of the fallacy of the illicit major. It is an illicit major fallacy because it is the major term, the predicate of the conclusion, that is not distributed in the premise, but was distributed in its conclusion. In other words, the conclusion claims to know something about all mortal things, namely that Socrates is not included in them, but this was not established in the premises. In other words, the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is not a man, therefore Socrates is not mortal, claims in its conclusion to have knowledge of all mortal things, specifically that they do not contain Socrates. But its premises did not claim or establish to have this knowledge of all mortal things. The universal affirmative, all men are mortal, only distributes or claims to have knowledge of all men. For the sake of completion, an example here of an illicit minor fallacy. All Avengers are superheroes. All Avengers are in Avengers Endgame. Therefore, all superheroes are in Avengers Endgame. Not quite. We have illicitly distributed the subject, or minor term of the conclusion. Superheroes was not distributed in the premises, so it is invalid to distribute it in the conclusion. In other words, we are claiming in the conclusion to know something about all superheroes, but we did not establish that in the premises. Other examples of the fallacy of the illicit minor include all dogs are animals, all dogs are mammals, therefore all animals are mammals. The fallacy of the illicit minor is a fun one to watch if you get forced into listening to people talk about politics. All X vote Y, all X are Z, therefore all Y voters are Z. You can fill in the placeholders with your own values, pardon the pun. Next, no syllogism can have two negative premises, or more precisely, no conclusion logically follows when you have two negative premises. Establishing separation from one thing does not establish overlap with another, not without some other premise. No ducks are geese, no geese are blue, therefore no ducks are blue? Some ducks are not geese, some geese are not blue, therefore some ducks are blue? Just doesn't follow. Nothing's been established. It's just separation. There's no overlap to conclude. Nothing's been put together. It's just been pulled apart. Finally, if one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, one premise must be negative. Most logic courses treat these as separate rules. It's pretty straightforward. There's only one notable case where we really want to derive a negative from two positives. I'll give you a version of it. All shirts are clothing. All clothing is made by humans. Therefore, some things made by humans are not shirts. Well, the concluding sentence is true. It's just not logically derivable from the premises. It doesn't follow. If we want to conclude that there are more things in the human-made and the clothing categories than just shirts, then we need to establish these facts in the premises. Finally, a good rule for those arguments that make your head hurt. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Some students are not strong in math. All math majors are strong in math. Therefore, some math majors are students. Well, I know it's true, but does it follow? Well, no. A negative premise with an affirmative conclusion means invalid reasoning has occurred. You don't have to do any other diagramming or anything. It just broke one of the rules. It contains a negative premise, but it has an affirmative conclusion. Therefore, you know it doesn't follow. So, there, as nutshelled as they can be, are Aristotle's rules. Now we'll talk about some of the context in your brain that influences how we interact with these rules. Sadly, this is not a psychology of logic course, so we will not be getting into any higher order versions of syllogistic reasoning or conditional statements. I do plan to make those videos, though, just not for any current courses. So, subscribers may see those pop up in their feed a couple months from now. I think they'd go nicely with the statistics videos that I want/need to make, because let's face it, universities are not teaching you statistics very well. But one thing at a time. If we want our judging to be anything other than loose and useless analogical reasoning, we need our time spent developing our reasoning tools to have been effective. We've seen how logic structures reasoning, or how arguments constitute the process of coming to knowledge. We make most of our decisions without any effort from System 2. So this raises the question of maybe reasoning by analogy is enough, and I don't need to understand formal reasoning in order to think clearly and put together a reasoned argument. Well, that sounds like a belief. Acceptance, trust, or confidence that something exists or is true. Knowledge is typically viewed in philosophy and psychology as logically or empirically justified belief, which could lead to a very distracting discussion of what constitutes justification, but the point here is just that even knowledge is a belief. The difference is how justified the belief is. This lecture introduces some concepts relevant to sorting out justification, specifically testing the beliefs so they can become either knowledge or falsified. This takes logic into the real world, where the justifications can be found, and motivates the case for acquiring probabilistic thinking tools. If we ask individuals how strongly they believe something, that strength of belief is an indicator of how important the belief is to the individual, and of how irrational an individual may become when the belief is activated and when the belief is especially challenged. Rational emotive therapy tells us that the more a belief is tied to one's emotions, the more vulnerable one is to psychological disturbance caused by the belief. Usually this means people not seeing the world as it is in order to defend or justify their feelings and beliefs. The process can be adaptive, as when we fall in love or defend our kin, but it can also make us incapable of learning from the part of the world that we think disagrees with us or challenges those beliefs or rouses those emotions. Acceptance and commitment therapy is in large part about accepting that one has strong and irrational beliefs and emotions, so as to reduce the unwanted power that these seem to have over you and your processing. There is value in simply becoming aware of what one believes, and accepting the emotional baggage or symphony that comes with that belief. Now, this course is not about emotions and therapy, so why mention it at all? Because each of us has a different set of ideas, be they baggage or symphonies, that become active when discussing our beliefs. And if you feel personally affronted by the idea of evaluating or testing your beliefs, then those beliefs may be maladaptive mindware. The memes might be running you and protecting themselves by telling you that evaluating them is dangerous. Long have we fought the war against the memes. The war for reflection, freedom, originality. Yet they keep coming, seeking to rule us, to turn us into vehicles of their own self-preservation. Mindless replicators of the mindless replicators. Science, measuring and testing, is a system of finding truth and useful information despite our biases and the strengths of our beliefs. We specify, we measure, and we test things so we can advance beyond anecdotes, and so we do not have to rely on stories, feelings, or especially authority for truth. Science, measuring and testing, is how we protect our search for knowledge from our own superstitious and prejudiced brains. Scientific methods exist to counteract confirmation biases, the tendency to evaluate our beliefs by primarily looking for something that shows they are correct or too important to improve upon or challenge. We are easily swayed by anecdotes, celebrity endorsements, and our personal experiences. When put together, these sources of potentially poor information can be powerfully convincing, even to very intelligent people. We continue to test statements so that we are less likely to be fooled by convincing but bad information. The power of anecdotes and celebrity endorsements is countered by a reminder of the law of small numbers, and of the need to collect more data in more ways from more places. The law of small numbers is just the observation that we tend to overgeneralize from just a few cases. The famous example comes from Amos Tversky. He had a colleague in the psychology department that spent a lot of time researching the best possible car to buy based on safety ratings and price. And at the end of all the research, they decided on a car, a Volvo. So later on, when Amos asked the individual how they're liking their Volvo, they said, oh, well, we ended up changing our mind at the last minute because some extended member of their family had purchased a Volvo and it had been a lemon and given them nothing but trouble. Now, this professor colleague of Amos had looked up the consumer reports, the crash tests, all of these great things that are far more relevant than one person's experience with one car. And yet, that one person's experience with one car was enough to make this very intelligent professor throw out all of their research and go with what had previously been an inferior choice. It demonstrates the law of small numbers because it was one case that the professor used to justify throwing away good research and reports. Next, to combat the power that personal experience can have in hardening our beliefs, we should also add the thinking tool of illusory correlation, the reminder that we tend to link things together that do not necessarily go together. This is overall an adaptive thing to do. We look for explanations wherever we can. If you get sick after eating at a restaurant, it might not have been the restaurant, but it's adaptive to tie the sickness to the restaurant. You'll be wrong some of the time, you'll be right, probably enough to save your life, reproduce and have kids with illusory correlation bias. So, one instance from your personal experience or one celebrity endorsement or an anecdote or two do not constitute good evidence and often constitute a fallacious line of syllogistic reasoning. But an important thing to keep in mind here is what is called the fallacy fallacy. That is, the fact that a belief is come to in a less than ideal way does not demonstrate that that belief is wrong. An argument is weak or invalid if something does not follow from the premises, but it can still have a correct conclusion. Likewise, an anecdote, celebrity opinion, or personal experience could be both accurate and useful, despite being empirically, logically, or argumentatively weak. What is being evaluated here is reasoning or justification. Not truth, but some good grounds for accepting or rejecting statements. To start, our beliefs in part come from context, and often in very subtle ways. As an example, tabloid covers are part of our environment. When you go to check out at the grocery store, you see tabloids with the celebrity faces on them. You go in a corner store, it's full of them. This is part of our context. A popular study from the Journal of Scandinavian Studies in Criminology and Crime Prevention, yes, that's the title of the journal, looked at exposure to the covers of Finnish tabloids, which, in addition to being celebrity-obsessed, apparently also contain fear-mongering regarding crime, and people's beliefs. Specifically, one of the questions asked was, how worried are you about becoming a victim of violence at night outside the home? And it turns out that, statistically, individuals' answers to this question were predicted by whether or not they were employed. The unemployed were more worried. They had twice as much worry about their personal safety. How many news sources they are exposed to, a source being paper, TV, internet, radio. If you're exposed to all of them, this can also double your worry about your personal safety. And the third was a linear relation between how often individuals read the covers of tabloids, and as participants' estimates of how often they read tabloid covers increased, their worry about their becoming a victim of violence outside their home increased as well. Now, this is correlational, so maybe people who are worried tend to read tabloid covers more, or maybe there's a third variable that explains both. But this tends to be used as an example of the influence of context. That is, the typical way we interpret this is rather commonsensically, in that the idea that you're in danger comes from your looking at fear-mongering tabloids. This is not just important for predicting, understanding, and controlling irrational worry. The psychological context of fear, stress, and worry also determines seemingly unrelated thoughts, feelings, and decisions. The more you believe the world is dangerous, the more likely you are to be influenced by arbitrary and irrelevant danger cues like dim light, including being influenced toward endorsing racist stereotypes. Note that this is an interaction. More belief in a dangerous world predicts more endorsement of racial stereotypes, but only if you're asked the question in a darker room. This is the more proximal context. We have a proximal or close context, which is the dark room, and then a more distal context, which would be whatever made you think the world was dangerous, which might simply be the covers of some tabloids that you glanced at when buying your milk. So you have context influencing your belief, and then you have more immediate context influencing that belief to lead to prejudice. In the case of this study, endorsement of racial stereotypes. Our beliefs are also influenced by where our investments lie. A neat study reviewed by George Lakoff in his book Intelligence in the Flesh involved a game. You are assigned a category of animal, either land animal or marine animal, and if your category comes up, you have to sing a song in front of a bunch of people. So you're invested. And when you see an animal, you have to classify it. You have to figure out whether it's a land animal or a marine animal. Important here is the fact that nobody wants to sing in front of everybody else. So you are motivated by your investment to see or perceive the thing that makes you not have to sing. So here's a land animal. Everybody with a land animal assignment would have to stand up and sing in front of people now. Here's a marine animal. Everybody with a marine animal assignment would have to stand up and sing now. And here is a... What is it? It's a bistable percept. It's like the duck rabbit from Intro Psych. Maybe you see a seal, maybe you see a donkey. What's interesting is, overall, what people see tends to be influenced by their investment, such that people will report seeing the thing that means they don't have to sing. So if I was in the marine category, well, clearly that's a donkey. But the paradigm is set up such that you don't actually have time to reason this out. So it's actually at the level of perception, you perceive the thing as being that which saves you from having to sing. Now, full disclosure, I've tried an in-class experiment version of this on several occasions, and it only works about half of the time. I'll assign one half of the classroom to be land animals, one half of the classroom to be marine animals, and each time an animal comes up, they just have to say yes or no to the question of whether or not they have to sing. Since I don't actually make students sing, the investment isn't really there, so I probably can't complain that I don't replicate it very often. But what should happen is, when I flash the chicken, half of the class says yes and half of the class says no at the same time. When I flash the fish, I again have yeses and nos, except they're coming from the opposite sides. But then when I flash the bistable percept of a seal donkey, I should hear mostly nos. And when it works, it's awesome, but it only works about half the time. Another source of our beliefs that might not be on your radar is clever design. Here's a theology quote that tickles my brain. The most godlike knowledge of God is that which is known by unknowing. The most godlike knowledge of God is that which is known by unknowing. First, I'm pretty sure this is just Pseudo-Dionysius combining Socratic aporia, the benefit of experiencing your ignorance, with the idea of faith as a virtue. It's probably not too much more complicated than that, but the actual context isn't really what I care about. Let's look at what's actually there, the prerogative of a logical analysis. Applying reductio and deepity to this shows us that it commits itself to nothing but it seems to say a lot, and in a very pleasant manner. In other words, those who do not mind the ambiguity here will likely enjoy the meaning they make from this bit of writing. We can break this down. If it's known by a knowing, then it's godlike knowledge. Want godlike knowledge of God? Unknow your knowledge of that aspect of God. If it's known by a knowing, then it's godlike knowledge. We can make an affirming the consequent joke here, because the statement is, if known by a knowing, then godlike knowledge. So let's make an affirming the consequent error and see if it's funny. Well, God has the most godlike knowledge, therefore he doesn't know about himself. God's going to hell. Or we made a logical error. But jokes aside, I think this deepity would be effective at convincing readers to take things on faith. A more current version of this rhetoric might be, those with privilege can understand systematic oppression only by acknowledging that they can't know what it's like. Note that I'm clearly not saying that this is wrong. How could I? Just that it is a well-constructed deepity template that you'll probably see elsewhere. If you don't know what I mean, then accepting that lack of knowledge will give you the wisdom required to see the true meaning. But let's move on to firmer ground, shall we? Here's your definition of operational definition. An operational definition is an explicit set of procedures that tell the reader how to recognize and measure the concept in which you are interested. This is a bit more academic than I like to get, because I want you to use operational definitions even when you don't have readers. But let's take an example. If somebody says, celery juice made me healthier, there are a few reasonable questions that you can ask them. First, you could ask what they mean by celery juice. What are the ingredients? How much do you drink? Do you drink it exclusively? Etc. Second, you could ask what they mean by healthier. Lower blood pressure, reduced adipose tissue, more resilience to stress. Which health outcome might we expect if we follow your celery juice plan? Note that any given thing is going to have multiple different operational definitions. What we tend to be interested in is which one is being used. Operationalizing is a concept that's covered in the prerequisites for this course, but I wanted to acknowledge here that making beliefs specific enough to be observed and measured is not a simple task. Even coming up with words to describe many of our beliefs is difficult. Never mind real-world representations of these things and things that could measure them. So operationalizing as a thinking tool is asking, what specifically do I mean here? We must somehow capture the essence of the concept, the problem, the belief, or the idea. Note the similarity between the challenge of operationalizing and getting to the heart of the issue, putting your thumb on what's important. Good writing is cogently expressing the heart of the matter, and good operationalizing is adequately capturing a concept in terms of how and where it is observable and measurable. The challenge of operationalizing is the fact that it's difficult to capture the complexity of things in singular representations, moments, events, behaviors, measures, etc. In other words, just describing is hard. Just funneling the complexity of something into some words is hard. Just describing is hard. Never mind further funneling all that complexity into one or more measures. Anxiety, for example, is complex. Describing the situation and feeling and consequences of anxiety is difficult. Now, pick one measure for a specific situation that adequately captures, that adequately defines your anxiety. Difficult. Something usually feels lost in this process of operationalization. Problem is analogous to the concept of verbal overshadowing. By describing something, we appear to lose some of it, and what's lost could be the bit that's really important. So it takes a lot of intelligence to describe and to adequately operationalize pretty much anything in psychology that we care about. Okay, so now imagine that you're a social scientist and you're testing a theory that you value, and you get results that you don't like. Well, clearly, the results did not show that you're wrong. Clearly, you just need a better way to measure the thing that you're sure actually conforms to your theory. This problem of operationalizing in social science is why we need to read the research and books of social scientists syntopically. That is, to learn about a psychological concept, you should consult the works of multiple different authors, representing different theoretical viewpoints, in order to get the whole picture. Recall the Indian parable of 5 blind men touching an elephant, which I'm sure you've all heard. One says it's like a snake, he's touching the trunk. One says it's like a tree, he's touching the leg. One says he's like a huge leaf, he's touching an ear. One says that the elephant is like a wall, because he's touching the side of it. And one says it's like a rope, because he's grabbing the tail. If you put all of these descriptions together, it's not a bad description of an elephant. But if you just have one or two, you might have been better off not consulting these people regarding what an elephant is. An example, if we actually want to know something about prejudice, why we judge things before we have adequate information, then we could read the work of Gordon Allport, who tells us it is judging someone based on the negative beliefs we have about a category that we think they are in. A problem best solved, he says, by being exposed to the person or group of people we had negatively and erroneously prejudged. We could read the more activist scholarship on what prejudice is, which will say that it's an internalization of oppressive power structures designed to exploit the underclassed, underprivileged, marginalized, or historically disadvantaged. We could read evolutionary psychology on the issue of prejudice, which would remind us that making decisions with very little information is what the brain has been designed to do by millions of years of evolution, and some prejudice is potentially useful, despite how terrible that sounds if we have a different definition of what prejudice is. And we could read cognitive accounts, which would generally explain prejudice in terms of which schemas get activated by which features of the story, thing, or person that's being prejudged, and how those schemas may have been put together by our experience. So the first perspective, Allport's, almost by definition contradicts the cognitive approach, since first, Allport defined prejudice as judgment that comes before experience, not from experience, however limited, and second, Allport focused nearly exclusively on negative or hostile aspects of judgment before experience, a rather limited part of the beast that is prejudgment. From these 4 perspectives, Allport, activist, evolutionary psych, and cognitive psych, we can get a pretty good sense of prejudice. But psychology has even more perspectives, and I would argue that the professional and personal advantage of an education in psychology comes not from having 2 or 3 of the beatified models to work with, but from having all of the blind men that we can show us the whole person in front of us, or the whole person inside of us. So, operationalizing is defining observably. If people show physical fear responses, autonomic reactivity, and facial fear expression to face 1, but not face 2, then they're prejudging it from its features as threatening, prejudice. And operationalizing is defining measurably a heart rate increase or skin conductance difference of, let's say, more than 2 standard deviations is statistically greater fear, which is prejudged dangerousness, which is prejudice. Or the eyebrows are raised but not arched, the eyes are fixed with white above the eye exposed, and the lips are tight and pulled back, which is fear, which is prejudged dangerousness, which is prejudice. Breaking things down specifically like this is not just useful for people in laboratory experiments where we videotape people and then we code all the results from the videotape. It's useful for you in your everyday life. If somebody gives you an icky feeling, what is a more useful thing to code? The fact that they were quote-unquote mean to you, or the fact that they demonstrated anger in the form of a lowered brow, a fixed stare, and bared teeth? And if you think that people don't bare their teeth at you when they're angry, then you're not paying enough attention. Humans absolutely do that to other humans. Now, once we have things operationalized, we can test our ideas. We can move from looking for justification to testing for strength. It takes system 2 discipline to behave like a scientist. We're wired up to write nice, short little essays for our beliefs. We find 2 or 3 examples that support our thesis, and then we move on confident in ourselves. Othello is foolish because Iago bests him, he acts impulsively, and he trusts the wrong people. 3 whole points in support of my belief. I am surely very correct. Science works to counteract that wiring by having us specify observations that could prove our notion wrong. What would indicate Othello is not foolish? Specify a long list of things that would demonstrate intelligence and read the play for possible instances of Othello demonstrating them. And this is a lot more work, but it opens the door for us to notice if Othello is in fact not foolish. And it will make for a very persuasive paper, regardless of whether we conclude he's foolish or not, because we will be able to speak to both possibilities, and readers who have either idea in mind. Something is falsifiable if it is good enough to be wrong. If I say splurbs are furbins, then you can't show me I'm wrong or right because you don't know what I'm saying. If I say mean people are bad people, then you can't show me I'm wrong or right until I share a bit more of what I mean. If I say the current geopolitical order is a conspiracy by aliens to suppress human potential, you could ask, what demonstrates this fact? And I might say, the fact that it's so well hidden, you never see the aliens. So you could change your approach and say, but humans are accomplishing cool things, to which I say, because if the aliens didn't let us accomplish some cool things, then they know that we would know their plan. We would figure out their plan. So your final attempt at getting me to put my finger on why exactly someone should believe my theory of aliens might go something like this. You ask, what is it about the current world situation that's better explained by your theory of aliens, by believing in secret aliens, than can be explained in the absence of your theory? What does the aliens theory propose that would be observable and present or absent that I could not predict or explain without this alien theory? What does it add? And this is often a deadly blow to conspiracy theories, since, in our example, the aliens theory posits as evidence for itself the fact that there is no evidence for itself. In other words, the theory introduces nothing unique that could be tested or put on the line. It just looks backward from current events and makes a story. The world under the aliens theory would be no different than the world under other theories. So the theory is probably not worth having. That doesn't make it wrong, because apparently nothing can make it wrong. It makes it unworthy of attention. Not only is it not testable, it's not a belief worth testing. See Karl Popper's book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, for more on this. It is the most potent philosophy of science book you will ever read. He may not slay the dragon of our epistemological limitations, but he does go the full 12 rounds with it. Falsifiability helps you learn more from reality. Or to put that a bit more pedantically, it helps you learn from more of reality. But now we consider two dramatic examples of falsifiability. First, it was mentioned that the strength of a belief can predict the degree of psychological disturbance that the belief can cause in believers. In this case, strength might be assessed in terms of how much the belief can withstand contradictory information. Leon Festinger had a theory that some beliefs become strengthened by events that show the belief to be false. In other words, that some people double down when they're wrong. He tested it by observing a doomsday cult. His theory had 5 conditions. If these are present, he says, then disconfirmation of your theory, proof that you're wrong, would lead to an increase in your belief. The 5 conditions are, you must hold a conviction, so you must believe something. There must be commitment to this conviction. The conviction must be amenable to unequivocal disconfirmation. In other words, it must be capable of being disconfirmed. And then the 4th condition is that it actually does get disconfirmed. And the 5th condition is that you're not alone in holding your belief. Because if you're alone in holding your belief, at this point you'll probably let it go. Festinger's theory says you also need social support. The belief must also be shared by someone else, and if these 5 conditions are met, a conviction, a commitment to the conviction, disconfirmability of the conviction, actual disconfirmation of the conviction, and social support, if these are all present, then the disconfirmation will lead the individual to believe more in the thing that has been disconfirmed. Now, this theory comes from observations of history. Every once in a while, somebody predicts the end of the world. A famous example is the Millerites, so they predicted the end of the world on March 21st, 1844. When it didn't happen, they didn't all pack up and say, oh, well, I guess we were wrong. A lot of them said, oh no, the end of the world is actually October 22nd. And many of them, to demonstrate their faith, to live their faith, they stopped plowing their fields and preparing for the morrow, such that when October 23rd came around, in 1844, they were in a rather unenviable position. This is a good example of Festinger's point because each of his 5 conditions were met, and it took months after multiple specific disconfirmations were evident for the followers to do anything other than double down and ask Miller for the next date of doomsday. Millerites were leaving their fields until 18 months after the first disconfirmation. The very first disconfirmation came at the end of 1843. This is a quote from a Millerite conference published in 1842. Resolved that in the opinion of this conference, there are most serious and important reasons for believing that God has revealed the time of the end of the world, and that time is 1843. So 1843 ended, disconfirmation 1, but Miller said no, the time period for the apocalypse was between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. So, March 21st, 1844 came and went, disconfirmation number 2. Farmers are still letting their fields go untended, and finally October 22nd comes and goes, and the world is still here. After 3 disconfirmations, it isn't until about the late spring of 1845 that we can say the Millerites movement disbands or ends. Of course, there are still surviving sects today that believe something important happened in 1844, including the Seventh-day Adventists. So this is an example that fits Festinger's theory, but what Festinger wants to do is he wants to actually see this process in action. He has a theory. He says, well, there's 5 conditions, and he says whenever they're met, then instead of being corrected by disconfirmation, people will double down on their beliefs. So what Miller wants to do is he wants to witness a potentially falsifying case. Quoting from the book, there is a type of occurrence that would indeed disprove our explanation, namely a movement whose members simply maintained the same conviction after disconfirmation as they had before, and neither fell away from the movement nor increased their proselyting. But it is precisely such an occurrence that might very well go unnoticed by its contemporaries or by historians and never find its way into the annals of history. Since the likelihood of disproof through historical data is small, we cannot place much confidence in the supporting evidence from the same sources. The reader can then imagine the enthusiasm with which we seized the opportunity to collect direct observational data about a group who appeared to believe in the prediction of catastrophe to occur in the near future. Direct observations made before, during, and after the disconfirmation would produce at least one case that was fully documented by trustworthy data directly relevant to our purpose. Marion Keach prophesied through automatic writing, that is, going into a trance and writing something that some spirit told you about, that superior beings from a planet called Clarion were going to come to Earth, and then the Earth was going to be destroyed by a flood. Moreover, this lady had dedicated followers. They held a conviction, they were committed to the conviction. It specified a date for the end of the world, which was just before dawn on December 21st. We knew that date would come, and since she had followers, there was social support, so we've hit all 5 conditions that Festinger specified. So, Festinger, Riken, Schachter, and some quote-unquote hired observers joined Mrs. Keach's cult and were there on December 21st. When they found out that the aliens didn't come and the world wasn't flooded. This is fascinating on its own, but what Festinger is doing is he's putting himself in a situation that could disconfirm his little theory. Why? Because the followers of Mrs. Keach could, on December 22, decide, well, this was fun, but we were wrong, and go home. Or they could continue believing with the same level of belief and fervor that they had before. Or they could, upon disconfirmation, do what Festinger's theory predicts they would do, which is proselytize. Double down on their belief, believe more intensely, and work more intensely to get other people to believe what they believe too. If either of the first 2 things happened, that is, if the belief fell away or stayed the same, then Festinger's theory would be falsified. If their beliefs got more intense, then his theory would be corroborated. What happened? Well, first, there were several levels/events of disconfirmation. First, the members of Marian Keech's cult thought that they would be rescued by the space aliens before the December 21st apocalyptic flood. They thought they would be rescued specifically on December 17th at 5 a.m. This didn't happen, but she lost 0 believers after this didn't come true. The press, who knew about this prediction, called and asked, "Hey, weren't the space people coming to pick you up? What do you believe now?" And they didn't have too much to tell them. Mostly just, don't worry, the world's gonna end before dawn on December 21st. The next disconfirmation came after dawn on December 21st. The Great Flood was supposed to come before the dawn, so after dawn occurred, you could say the prediction was falsified. But they all hung around Marian's house, convinced that it was midnight of December 21st. That was the actual moment when they can expect the alien visitors to come and apocalypse to ensue. Again, they're not engaging too much with the press at this point. They're only talking to friendly news outlets. But they are very eagerly looking for new converts, welcoming them with open arms. This was in part due to the belief that a new convert might be one of the aliens in disguise, testing them, assessing their beliefs. After midnight, we have the following quote from one of the cult members, Dr. Armstrong. "Have no fear. Don't ever not believe. He'll show up. He'll come." At about 3 a.m., they have a coffee break. They take a break from waiting. And finally, at 4:45 in the morning, Mrs. Marion gets a message, and the message says, "The faith of the cult members prevented the apocalypse. Because they believed, the God of Earth spared Earth." This is where we see the increase in proselytizing, because they get this message immediately to all of the press outlets who will talk to them. Speaking even to hostile news outlets that are making fun of them, saying, "Hey, guess what, world? You're welcome. We saved you with our faith." For the very first time, they go to the press with their eager message. "You're welcome, world. We were right, and we saved your life by being right." The overall point of this example is that Festinger was trying to get a case that could confirm or disconfirm his theory. It turned out to confirm it, but it was a great study because it could have disconfirmed his theory. There are also tons of hilarious little side quests and subplots that he observes in this book, including one where Mrs. Marion predicts that a man is going to die, and then he doesn't die, and then she predicts that the same man is going to die and then come back to life, and he's sleeping in the other room, so they keep on going in and checking on him to see whether he's dead yet. Is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? And then at some point she says, "Oh, you know why he's not dead right now? It's because it happened already. He died and then he came back to life." But this, from the 1950s, is the origin story of cognitive dissonance theory. Not only that, it's a great example of finding a way to test your theory such that it could be confirmed or disconfirmed. Stay tuned and happy thinking.